Hello everyone. I just saw another Piers Morgan interview. This time though, this guy said,
to go to that site to be able to receive services for life in an active combat zone is a war crime. I would welcome you to read the protocols of the Geneva Convention,
well,
sir.
let's do it. In this video, let's review the Geneva Convention, Humanitarian Aid Regulation, and how all of this is being applied in international law. Before we continue though, I'd like to make a bold but true statement. International law doesn't exist. This is because sovereign countries are by definition not a subject to any higher authority. The existence of international law per se would be contradictory to the very principle of sovereignty of countries. In other words, either international law exists and countries are not truly sovereign, or international law doesn't exist. There is no other way. What then? Why does everyone talk about international law all the time? Because of treaties. Treaties are agreements signed between sovereign countries. As a sovereign entity, a country, out of its own free will, can bind itself to a certain agreement. If the said country doesn't abide by the agreement, then it's only breaking its own word. Since 99.9% of people have no idea what Geneva Convention is, people falsely assume that anyone who violates the Geneva Convention is in violation of international law. Wrong. Geneva Convention is a treaty like any other. Only countries that are signatories are bound to it, and even that they can retract at any moment they want. After all, this is the definition of sovereignty and independence: free will. Knowing all of this, now let's review the situation in Gaza. My usual approach in debates is first to check if the claim is irrelevant before responding to it. Guess what? Any claim based on Geneva Convention is irrelevant to the conflict in Gaza. Remember this rule. Here is why. Hamas is not a signatory to the Geneva Convention. Imagine if this were a marriage certificate. I am signed on mine. But does it mean that the terms of it apply to any woman I meet? Of course not. Geneva Convention is something Israel signed with other countries, but not with Hamas. Hamas is not even a country. It's a terrorist organization holding not only Israelis as hostages, but also Gazans. Some people claim that Israel is a signatory to the Geneva Convention and must abide by it. But it's a treaty, not a law. In other words, going back to my marriage certificate analogy, everyone has to abide by marriage certificates. Yes, but each certificate binds two different people. Israel and Hamas are not quote-unquote married. Therefore, neither side is bound by any treaty. War with Hamas is different, let's say, from a war with Lebanon or Syria, who are signatories to that treaty. Well, if you don't believe me, here's the technical explanation. A treaty enters into force as soon as consent to be bound by the treaty has been established for all the negotiating states. No agreement is binding in unilateral form. There must be two sides to any agreement. Did Hamas sign on Geneva Convention Treaty? No, then not all sides are agreed to be bound. Therefore, Geneva Convention did not enter into force in Gaza, and it's not applicable. The lawyer wannabes online claim that the Geneva Convention obligates the signatory states to follow it even if the other side is not a signatory. Here's why they say it. Although one of the powers in conflict may not be a party to the present convention, the powers who are parties thereto shall remain bound by it in their mutual relations. However, there is a catch. If the latter accepts and applies the provisions thereof. Does Hamas agree in principle to Geneva Convention? No. It holds hostages. Guess what? Taking of hostages is prohibited. In recent conflict only, Hamas has violated just this one 251 times. Cruel treatment and torture. Look at what they do to this person. Outrages upon personal dignity. Is it dignifying to dig your own grave? Passing of sentences and carrying out execution. I'm not going to share it here, but trust me, there is plenty of evidence for that as well. The wounded and sick shall be collected and cared for. Hamas violated all of these. By the way, for this same reason, even if Hamas were a party to the Geneva Convention Treaty, which is not, Israel would still not be bound by it at all. Here is proof. A material breach of a bilateral treaty is a ground for terminating the treaty or suspending its operation in whole or in part. Taking hostages violates Article 34 of Geneva Convention. Taking of hostages is prohibited. This is clearly essential to the accomplishment of the object or purpose, of the Geneva Convention, which is to protect civilians in armed conflict. Hamas took this person as a hostage and forced him to dig his own grave in the tunnels, just like Nazis did during the Holocaust. This violation alone would be enough to suspend the whole Treaty of Geneva Convention, even if it were applicable, which is not. Make no mistake, if there's a difference between Hamas and the Nazis, it is that Nazis tried to hide what they did to the Jews, while Hamas and their supporters are proud of it. Given all this information, it is safe to conclude that the Geneva Convention rules do not apply in Gaza at all. What now? Want to talk about humanitarian aid? Let's go. Let's assume the Geneva Convention applies in Gaza. Is Israel obligated to feed its enemy? Under IHL, an obligation to actively provide humanitarian relief only arises for an occupying power regarding the population in the territory which is under its belligerent occupation. Oh, but Israel is not an occupying power in Gaza. Israel withdrew in 2005. But what if Israel were an occupying power? Can it block aid? Let's check. Oh, so it cannot block aid. However, there is a catch again, unless compelling military reasons forbid. Does Israel have reasons to block it? Yeah. Hamas takes all aid and starves its population. This has been well documented. Does it pose a military difficulty for Israel? Yes. Aid is being used by Hamas to stay in power. Without it, they would capitulate over a year ago. Can Israel monitor and set logistic rules as to how the aid is being provided? Yeah. Here it is again. Each high contracting power has the right to prescribe the technical arrangement under which such passage is allowed. By the way, high contracting party means countries signed on the Geneva Convention. Hamas has not signed it. Now, after knowing all of the above, and I encourage you to rewatch and to reshare this as much as you can, let's review. Geneva Convention doesn't apply in Gaza. Even if it did, it would be nullified by the fact that Hamas violates its rules. Even if it still applied for military reasons outlined in the Geneva Convention, Israel is still within its rights to block or manage it. And of course, since Gaza is not an occupied territory, Israel doesn't have the slightest obligation to supply its enemy, the modern Nazis, with humanitarian aid. Technically speaking, in Gaza, Israel is free to conduct warfare outside of the provisions of Geneva Convention or any other treaty. But it doesn't. Israel operates according to all the rules, and it does it at a very dear price. Israel is one of the smallest nations but the largest family in the world. While tolerating Hamas, we have lost almost 1,000 family members as soldiers in this war. 2 million tons of provisions were supplied to Gaza. If handled properly, it is enough to feed 4.5 million people. That's almost twice their population. 66,000 trucks were sent to Gaza. If you put all of them together, that's like the size of Monaco. Thank you for watching.